Hey guys, tonight we are settling into a world of covered dishes, pressed aprons, and a set of unspoken rules so strict they could make a military general feel underdressed. We're talking about the 1970s American housewife, specifically the invisible rule book she carried with her every single day, through every grocery run and dinner party and Tuesday morning, without ever being handed a copy of it in writing. Before we begin, take a moment to like this video and subscribe if this quiet little corner of history feels like home to you. And a genuinely warm thank you to the viewer who suggested this topic. You always send the most thoughtful ideas, and this one in particular felt too important to wait on. Your suggestions are what shape this channel, and it means more than you know. For those of you who prefer to listen on the go, the channel is also on Spotify now. You can find the link in the description below. Go ahead and follow along there whenever you like. Now dim the lights, pull a blanket over your lap, switch on a fan for that soft, steady hum. Get yourself fully comfortable, the kind of comfortable where you're not planning to move for a while, and let the evening quiet settle around you. Because tonight we're going somewhere specific. Somewhere that smelled like lemon pledge and pot roast and drugstore perfume. Somewhere that felt simultaneously safe and suffocating, warm and watchful. We're going into the homes and habits and unspoken expectations of women who kept entire households running with grace, precision, and a smile that never quite told you everything. Have you ever wondered what it actually felt like to be a housewife in the 1970s? Not the television version, not the one in the magazines, but the real, daily, lived version. What did a Wednesday feel like when your entire identity was organised around other people's needs? What did it mean to have opinions about the colour of your own living room curtains, but still ask permission before buying them? Did those women know the rules were rules? Or did they simply breathe them in so young that the rules became indistinguishable from air? What happened in the quiet hours, when the children were at school and the husband was at work and the house was finally briefly yours? What did it cost in small and enormous ways to smile through all of it? And just like that, it is 1973. The percolator is going. Somewhere a neighbour's AM radio is drifting through the kitchen window. There is a casserole to plan and a school to call and a list sitting on the counter that already has 12 things on it before you've finished your first cup of coffee. The day is just beginning, and the rules, unspoken and immovable, are already in motion. Let us start with the morning, which was never really yours. By the time the children were fed and the husband had his coffee, and the front door had clicked shut behind everyone who needed somewhere to be, you had already been performing for 2 hours, not performing in any theatrical way, nothing so dramatic as that, but performing in the quieter sense, the sense that required you to be dressed, composed, and presentable before any of it began. The rule was not written anywhere. It did not need to be. It lived in the way your mother kept her hair set even on Saturday mornings, in the way the women in your neighbourhood never appeared at the mailbox in something they would be embarrassed to be seen in. Looking put together was not vanity. It was expectation. And in the 1970s, expectation had the weight of law. The thing about this particular rule was how early it started. Not early in the morning, though it did start early in the morning, early in your life. You absorbed it the way children absorb most things, without being taught it directly, by watching and sensing and gradually understanding what the world around you rewarded. You watched your mother smooth her blouse before answering the door. You watched her check her lipstick in the small mirror near the kitchen window before your father came home. You understood, without anyone explaining it, that the way a woman looked was not incidental. It was a kind of message she sent continuously, whether she intended to or not, and the receiving end of that message was always crowded. By the 1970s, this expectation had developed its own particular vocabulary. The house dress had given way in many households, to something slightly more composed. Slacks were acceptable now, in ways they had not always been. Hair did not always need to be set in the formal sense, though it needed to be managed, shaped into something that said, "I have taken care of myself today," which was understood to mean I've taken care of everything else too. There was a logic to it, if you lived inside the logic long enough. A woman who looked put together was a woman who had things under control. A woman who had things under control was a good wife, a good mother, a good neighbour. The appearance was not separate from the character assessment. It was the first line of it. You kept, somewhere near the bathroom mirror, the things you needed. A lipstick in a neutral shade, the kind that read as effortless rather than made up. A comb. Something for your eyes, though not too much. You had learned the calibration over years. Too little and you looked tired, which invited questions. Too much and you looked as though you were trying, which invited different questions. The target was the narrow band in the middle. The look that said, "This is simply how I am," even when it had taken 20 minutes to achieve. There were women on your street who had perfected this so completely that you genuinely could not imagine them looking any other way. Your neighbour 2 doors down, the one with the immaculate front porch and the hydrangeas that bloomed in July like they had been given instructions. She answered her door at 10 in the morning in a clean blouse with a hairbrush smooth and a pleasant expression that contained no visible trace of whatever had happened before you knocked. You admired this. You also felt the pressure of it, the way an ideal always exerts a quiet, gravitational pull on the people near it. The unspoken audience for all of this was not always external. Sometimes it was internal, the version of yourself that had been trained to evaluate your own presentation before you'd finished your first cup of coffee. You caught yourself in the hall mirror on the way to the mailbox and made a small adjustment. You noticed, before guests arrived, that something needed to be refreshed. The self-monitoring was so constant and so habitual that it had long since stopped feeling like effort. It had simply become part of the texture of the day, like checking the weather or listening for the children. What the 1970s were beginning to whisper, in the magazines that were changing and the conversations that were shifting, was that this rule had always been optional, that the performance of composure was not the same thing as composure itself, that a woman's appearance before noon said nothing meaningful about her character, her intelligence, her worth, her inner life. Some women were starting to hear that whisper and to pause with it, to hold it in their hands and turn it over and wonder. But the wondering was still quiet. The rule was still loud. And most mornings you got dressed the way you always had, because the world you moved through had not yet caught up with the question, and you still had a door to answer and a morning to get through and a family watching, always watching to see how it was done. You could disagree. That was permitted in theory, within the careful geography of a private conversation, in the kitchen after the dishes were done, in the low voice that didn't carry past the bedroom door. But out in the world, at a dinner party, at a neighbour's backyard gathering, in the parking lot of the church, you did not contradict him. Not loudly, not sharply, not in the way that would make someone look up from their plate. The rule was ancient by the time the 1970s arrived, older than anyone's grandmother, and yet it sat at the table with you every time you went out, patient and watchful, reminding you of the particular kind of loyalty that was expected not just of a wife, but of a good wife. What made this rule so durable was how thoroughly it had been reframed as kindness. You didn't stay quiet out of fear, the thinking went. You stayed quiet out of respect, out of love, out of a mature understanding that your husband's dignity in public was something worth protecting, the same way you would protect the good china or the carefully tended front lawn. His standing among other men was fragile in ways that no one named directly but everyone understood. A wife who contradicted him at the dinner table was not simply disagreeing, She was doing something to him, diminishing him in the eyes of people whose regard he depended on in ways the household depended on in turn. You learned the techniques young, the subtle redirect, the soft change of subject that arrived just before a conversation went somewhere dangerous, the gentle laugh that could dissolve a tense moment before it hardened into something visible. If he said something factually incorrect at someone else's table, about a year or a name or the outcome of some local event, you let it stand. You did not catch his eye meaningfully. You did not offer the correction wrapped in sweetness. You let it stand, because the correction was not worth the cost of what followed it. Later, at home, in the kitchen, quietly, you might mention it, or you might not. The decision was always a small calculation. There were women who were better at this than others, and their names were spoken in a particular tone of admiration. "She is so gracious," people said, and gracious covered a great deal. It covered the bitten-back response and the careful smile and the years of practice that went into making disagreement invisible. To be called gracious was to be told that your restraint had been observed and approved of, that you had navigated the social geography correctly, that you had protected something without appearing to be protecting it. It was a compliment that contained, if you held it long enough, its own particular sadness. The 1970s were the decade in which some of this began to be questioned publicly and loudly, and in terms that made certain dinner tables uncomfortable. Women were writing about it and speaking about it on television, and gathering in living rooms to describe the specific exhaustion of this kind of silence, the way it accumulated over years into something heavier than any single instance of it suggested. The conversation was happening. It was real, and it was arriving into households where the old rules were still very much in operation, where a woman might watch a television interview about the right to her own voice, and then, an hour later, stay quiet at the dinner table about something she knew to be wrong, not because she'd not heard the conversation, but because the world she actually lived in had not yet reorganized itself around it. The knowing and the doing were separated by a distance that the decade had not yet found a way to fully close. There is a specific moment in the mid-afternoon of a 1970s Housewives' day that carries more weight than it might appear to from the outside. It is approximately 4:30, sometimes 5, and you're already watching the clock in the small, half-conscious way you've been trained to watch it. Dinner needs to be close to ready. The children need to be manageable. The house needs to look as though it has not been lived in all day, even though it absolutely has. And you, yourself, need to look as though the last 8 hours happened to someone else entirely. The greeting at the door was not merely a greeting. It was the opening note of an evening performance, and you were expected to know your part before the music started. The magazines had been explicit about this for decades. Not harshly explicit, never that, but explicit in the cheerful, instructive way that women's publications of the mid-century had perfected. Freshen your lipstick before he arrives. Tidy the living room. Make sure the children are calmed. Greet him warmly. The advice was delivered with the same friendly authority as a recipe, as though the evening transition was simply another domestic skill to be developed with practice. Something you would eventually get good at, the way you eventually got good at pastry dough, or removing a stain from white cotton. What the magazines did not quite address was what this meant on the days when the last 8 hours had been genuinely difficult, when a child had been sick since morning, and you had not sat down since 7, when something in the house had broken, and you had spent an hour on the phone being transferred between people who could not help you, when you were tired in the specific way that comes not from physical exertion, but from the continuous expenditure of patience, from being needed without pause, from managing the emotional weather of small children who had no idea what it cost. On those days, the freshening of the lipstick was an act of considerable will, and no one called it that. The children absorbed the rhythm of it too. They understood, in the wordless way children understand the rules of the households they grow up in, that the hour before their father came home had a different quality than the rest of the day. The television was sometimes turned down. Arguments were to be resolved. The kitchen needed to smell like something. There was a general tightening of the domestic atmosphere, a pulling together of elements that had been scattered across the day into something that would read as order when the door opened. He might notice none of this. In many households he did not, or at least did not comment on it, and his not commenting was understood as a kind of approval. The evening proceeded. Dinner was served. The conversation followed whatever course it followed. And the effort that had gone into the transition, the quiet hour of preparation and composure, dissolved into the ordinariness of the evening, leaving no visible trace. That was, in a way, the point. The best version of the greeting rule was one that looked like it required no effort at all. Effort, visible and acknowledged, would have meant that something had come close to not working. And in a 1970s household, things were supposed to work. Quietly, reliably, and without anyone having to ask. The kitchen smelled of something warm and deliberate from mid-afternoon onward, and that was not an accident. It was the result of planning that began the night before, sometimes earlier, because dinner in a 1970s household did not simply happen. It was constructed, scheduled, and presented. There were women on your street whose reputations rested in no small part on the quality of their Tuesday pot roast. That is not an exaggeration. Hospitality was measurable, and the measuring happened most often at the table, in the evenings, in the quiet moment when a fork met a plate and the room waited just for a second for the verdict. Cooking was the craft you had been handed, usually by your mother, sometimes by a home economics teacher, who drew diagrams on a chalkboard about proper knife technique and the internal temperature of poultry. You came to it not as an interest you had cultivated, but as a responsibility you had inherited, the way you inherited the good serving dishes and the understanding that certain things were simply what women did. And most women of the 1970s did cook every day, sometimes twice, in the way that people perform any skill practiced over enough years, automatically, competently, and not always with joy. The weekly meal plan was a real document in many households. It lived on a notepad on the counter, or in your head so firmly that the notepad was unnecessary. Monday was one thing, Tuesday another, and the planning of it required knowing what was in the freezer and what was on sale at the grocery store and who had a practice or a meeting that would shift the dinner hour by 30 minutes. You managed this the way you managed everything, by paying continuous low-level attention, by holding in your mind a map of the week's obligations and adjusting as new information arrived. The jello mould and the green bean casserole and the carefully arranged relish tray were not jokes, not yet. They were the language of care expressed in the only way the era had fully sanctioned for women of your background. You brought a dish to a gathering, and it said something about you. It said, I took the time. It said, I know how to feed people. It said, I understand what this occasion requires, and I rose to meet it. The dish was never just a dish. It was a small declaration of competence in the domain you had been assigned. What the 1970s was slowly beginning to permit was the idea that some women might not want to cook, or might want to cook less, or might want their cooking to be acknowledged as labour rather than simply as love made edible. Those conversations were happening in some households, and not at all in others. And in the meantime, the mid-afternoon kitchen smelled of something warm and deliberate, and the table was set before anyone thought to question who had set it, or why that task had always belonged to the same pair of hands. Walk down any residential street in 1974 America, and you were, without quite meaning to, making assessments. The lawn told you something. The curtains told you something. The state of the front porch, the presence or absence of seasonal flowers, the particular angle at which the welcome mat was positioned. All of it spoke in a language that everyone in the neighbourhood understood. A woman's home was understood to be a woman's statement about herself, about her values, about how seriously she took her responsibilities. It was not fair. But it was the operating assumption, and it shaped the way women spent their mornings, their afternoons, and the frantic half hour before anyone was expected to drop by. The front of the house was the public face, and it was maintained with an awareness that the neighbourhood was always, in some peripheral way, watching. Not maliciously, not even consciously most of the time, but the watching was there, built into the structure of the community the way the sidewalks were built in, a feature so ordinary it had become invisible. You weeded the front garden not only because you wanted a tidy garden, you weeded it because an untidy garden communicated something you did not want to communicate. The communication was constant. The audience was permanent. Inside, the stakes were different but no less present. The living room that guests entered first was a curated space, held to a standard higher than the rooms no one saw. The furniture was arranged to suggest both comfort and order. The surfaces were cleared of the small debris of daily life, the permission slips and the library books and the cereal bowl that had migrated from the kitchen. When company came, the house became a version of itself that required maintenance to sustain, and the maintenance was yours. There was a specific smell associated with a well-kept 1970s home. It was clean without being clinical. It contained something warm from the kitchen, something faintly floral from the bathroom, and underneath it all the particular scent of a house that had been attended to, that had been wiped and swept and aired out on the days when the weather permitted the windows to be opened. You knew this smell from other women's houses. You worked toward it in your own. It was the olfactory equivalent of a pressed blouse. It said the same thing. I have taken care of this. I take care of things. The neighbours you liked best were the ones who understood the silent compact without needing it explained. They did not let their grass go brown in July if they could help it. They kept their garbage cans at the side of the house rather than visible from the street. They did not hang laundry in the front yard. These were small things. They were also, in the geography of the neighbourhood's social understanding, not small at all. They were the evidence of shared standards, the proof that you were all, together, maintaining something worth maintaining. And the woman at the centre of each household was the one who made that maintenance happen, day after day, in ways that would never be counted or credited, only noticed in their absence. Money was one of the most complicated territories in a 1970s marriage, and it was complicated in ways that were rarely spoken about directly. Most households operated on a single income, which meant that the woman who ran the house, who managed the grocery list and the school supplies and the utility payments and the birthday gifts and the unexpected cost of just living, did all of that management on funds that were not technically hers. She might have a household budget, she might have an allowance, a word that carries its own quiet weight when applied to a grown adult. And when she needed something outside of that budget, the asking of it had its own particular etiquette, its own soft choreography of timing and framing and not wanting to seem wasteful. You learned early that timing was everything. You did not ask on a Monday morning when the week was just beginning to press down on both of you. You did not ask when something had gone wrong with the car or the furnace, when money was already carrying its own anxious charge in the household atmosphere. You waited for the right evening, one that had gone well, dinner that had been received warmly, a mood that was open rather than closed, and then you brought it up with a particular lightness that made it seem like less than it was. You had practiced this. You didn't think of it as practicing, but you had refined it over years in the same way you refined anything you did repeatedly until it looked effortless. The thing you were asking for was rarely extravagant. A winter coat to replace the one that had worn through at the cuffs, a small repair to something in the kitchen, a gift for a friend's wedding that needed to be appropriate to the relationship and the occasion. These were not luxuries. They were the ordinary requirements of a life being managed carefully on behalf of an entire family. and yet they required asking. They required a conversation that had a particular kind of vulnerability in it, the vulnerability of needing and not having independent access to the means of addressing the need. Some women kept a small amount of money set aside from the grocery budget, moved in increments too small to notice, stored in an envelope at the back of a kitchen drawer. This was not spoken of. It was not planned in any deliberate way. It simply accumulated. $1 here, $2 there, against the day when something needed to be handled quietly, without the asking. The envelope was not a secret kept out of deception. It was a secret kept out of the exhaustion of the asking, a small private management of a situation that the era did not yet have better tools to address. By the middle of the 1970s, some of the legal landscape around women and money was beginning to change. A woman could open her own bank account without her husband's signature. Credit in her own name was becoming possible in ways it had not been before. These changes were real and significant, but the daily reality of most households was slower to shift than the laws were. The money still came in through one door and was distributed according to one person's judgment, and the asking still required its careful navigation, its right moment, its particular art of making a need sound like something smaller than it was. Company was not casual in a 1970s household, not the way it sometimes is now, where a friend might stop by on a Tuesday and find you in sweatpants with the breakfast dishes still on the counter and nobody particularly bothered. Then company was an event, and events required preparation. The house was cleaned to a standard several degrees above its daily standard. Food was made or purchased with more deliberateness than usual. Children were coached on their best behaviour, and you, the woman at the centre of it all, were expected to appear effortless, which is perhaps the most exhausting thing that has ever been expected of anyone. The preparation began days in advance for a real occasion. The menu was planned with attention to the preferences of the guests, the season, what was available at the grocery store that week, and what you had made before without incident. You did not experiment on company. That was a rule unto itself. You served the things you knew, executed with enough care that they rose above their everyday versions into something that communicated occasion. The casserole you made on Tuesdays became something else entirely when it was placed in the good dish and set on the table with a proper centerpiece, and the cloth napkins you only brought out when there was a reason. The house on the day of company required its own kind of attention. Not the ordinary maintenance cleaning, but a deeper pass, the baseboards in the guest bathroom and the surfaces that guests might touch. The coffee table arranged with intention, the bathroom towels replaced with the good ones, the small details that no guest would consciously notice, but that would register somewhere in the aggregate impression of the evening as everything was just right. This was the standard. It was the standard because a woman who hosted well was a woman who cared, and a woman who cared was a woman worth knowing. What the preparation cost was never part of the accounting. The fatigue that arrived with the first guests, already present behind the smile that greeted them at the door, was invisible by design. You had rehearsed the effortlessness. You moved through your own kitchen as though the meal had materialized without labor. You refreshed the appetizer tray and returned to the table, and laughed at the right moments, and kept the conversation from going anywhere uncomfortable, and none of the management was supposed to show. The evening, from the outside, was a gift your household gave to its guests. From the inside, it was a considerable production that you had been the sole producer of, from concept to curtain call. The children were yours in the daytime. That is the simplest way to describe it. The school pickups, and the scraped knees, and the homework, and the arguments, and the slow, patient work of teaching small people how to be people, all of that lived in the hours between drop-off and dinner, in the territory you managed and navigated largely on your own. But the evening shifted things. When the front door opened and the day folded itself into something shared, the authority redistributed in a way that everyone understood without a conversation being required. Your word was provisional. His was final. And the children, perceptive as children always are, learned the geography of it early. This was not a conscious cruelty. It rarely was. It was simply the architecture of how the household understood itself, absorbed from the household both of you had grown up in, passed down without discussion the way most foundational assumptions are passed down. The mother was present and patient and the source of most daily comfort. The father was the authority one level up, the court of final appeal, the presence whose opinion on a matter closed it. Wait until your father gets home carried real weight, not because he was frightening, but because he was final. What this meant practically was that your authority with your own children operated under a ceiling you could not raise yourself. You made the daily decisions, hundreds of them, about food and sleep and discipline and what was permitted and what was not. You knew these children in the deep, specific way that comes from continuous proximity, from being the one who was there for the ordinary Tuesday afternoon as much as for the significant events. You knew which one needed more patience and which one needed more firmness, and the particular words that reached each of them in the moments when words mattered. And yet your knowledge, however complete, was subordinate to a voice that entered the household for a few hours each evening and on weekends. Some fathers navigated this with grace, deferring in practice to the mother's accumulated knowledge while maintaining the formal structure of authority the era expected. Others exercised the authority more literally, overriding decisions that had already been made, sending a signal to the children that the rules shifted depending on who was in the room. The children, as children do, adapted. They learned which parent to ask depending on the answer they hoped for. They learned to read the household's shifting geography and move through it accordingly. The 1970s were a decade in which parenting itself was beginning to be reconsidered, in books and magazine articles and the quiet conversations between women at the school pickup line who had started to notice and to name the imbalance they had been living inside. The naming was new, the imbalance was old, and in the meantime the daily work of raising children continued in its uneven distribution, in the households where the mother knew everything and the father decided, and the distance between those two positions was wide enough to spend a lifetime standing in without quite seeing the edge. There were feelings that belonged in a 1970s household, and feelings that did not. Joy was welcome. Warmth was welcome. Gentle humour, the kind that made company feel at ease, was very welcome. But frustration, expressed at a volume anyone could hear, was not. Loneliness was manageable if you kept it to yourself. Ambition was complicated. Grief was permitted in private briefly. The general emotional expectation was something like serenity, or at least the performance of it, because the alternative, a woman who was visibly unhappy, visibly struggling, visibly wanting something different, was socially inconvenient in ways that the era had no good language for addressing. The cheerfulness that was expected of you was not a simple thing. It was layered and practiced and context-specific. There was the cheerfulness for company, bright and hospitable and turned up a register above your ordinary pitch. There was the cheerfulness for the children, patient and warm and sustained across the long hours when patience was being drawn down faster than it was replenished. There was the cheerfulness for your husband, softer than the others, more intimate, though no less performed on the days when you had arrived at evening already depleted. Each version required a different calibration. You moved between them without thinking, the way you move between rooms. What you did with the feelings that did not belong in any of these registers is something that varied by woman, by household, by temperament, and by what resources were available. Some women had a sister or a close friend who could receive the full truth of a hard week, someone who would sit with you at the kitchen table on a Thursday afternoon and hear it without judging or advising or redirecting toward gratitude. Those friendships were lifelines. They were also understood to be private, the contents of them sealed against the wider social world where the performance of cheerfulness was always in operation. The doctor's office was another place where some of the weight could be set down, though the setting down was rarely straightforward. The particular exhaustion of the 1970s housewife was often medicalized in ways that addressed the symptom rather than the structure. Valium was prescribed in remarkable quantities during this decade to women who were described by their doctors and by themselves as anxious or nervous, or not quite managing. The pill addressed the distress without requiring anyone to examine what was causing it. It was, in its way, the pharmaceutical version of the same logic that shaped every other rule in the housewife's life. Adjust the woman, and the system can continue as it is. By the mid-1970s, something in the public conversation was beginning to push back against this. The feelings that did not belong in the household were being articulated in books and in newly formed groups of women who sat in living rooms and discovered, collectively, that what they had each assumed was a private failing was in fact a shared condition. The discovery was, for many women, both painful and profoundly relieving. Painful because it named something that had been unnamed for a long time, relieving for exactly the same reason. There is a passage in many of the women's magazines of the early 1970s, the kind your mother kept stacked on the coffee table, with a bookmark in the casserole section, that describes the importance of looking attractive for your husband as though it was simply a matter of good housekeeping. Practical, reasonable, a task to be added to the list between the ironing and the grocery run. The suggestion was never cruel, not in tone. It was delivered in the same warm, instructive voice that told you how to get grass stains out of white cotton. But it carried within it an entire system of expectation, one that said your physical appearance was not yours alone to decide about. It was something you maintained on behalf of someone else. The bathroom counter in a 1970s household was a particular landscape. Cold cream in its wide-mouthed jar, white and faintly medicinal smelling. A row of lipsticks in the shades the magazines were endorsing that season. Earthy pinks and soft corals that were supposed to be natural-looking while requiring considerable effort to apply correctly. Rollers and pins, the particular smell of hairspray, sharp and chemical, and somehow comforting in the way that familiar smells always are, regardless of their actual properties. You move through this landscape every morning and every evening, performing the ritual with the efficiency of long practice, not as an act of pleasure necessarily, but as a maintenance routine as ordinary as brushing your teeth. The measuring of whether you were meeting the standard was constant and came from multiple directions at once. There were the magazines that told you what you should look like. There were the neighbours whose appearance you registered in the same peripheral continuous way they registered yours. There were the comments that arrived sometimes directly and sometimes obliquely. The mother-in-law who noted with a particular smile that you looked tired, meaning something adjacent to tired. The friend who said you look so much better when you do your hair. A compliment that contained within it the implication of what you looked like when you did not. And then there was the quieter measuring, the kind that happened between a husband and wife without language, in the way attention was given or not given, in the small signals of a marriage's daily weather. You'd been told in so many adjacent ways that keeping yourself attractive was part of keeping your marriage intact, that a husband whose wife let herself go was a husband who might eventually look elsewhere, and that the looking elsewhere would be, at least in part, your responsibility. This was not spoken of in those terms usually, but it was the subtext of a great deal of the advice that surrounded you, and you had grown up inside that subtext long enough that it had become indistinguishable from your own thinking. What the 1970s were beginning to introduce into this conversation, unevenly and not without resistance, was the question of whether any of it had ever been true. Whether a woman's appearance was genuinely the mortar holding a marriage together, or whether that idea had served a particular set of interests that had nothing to do with her well-being. The question was uncomfortable. It arrived into households where women had spent years and considerable energy on the answer they had been given, and the sitting with it, the holding of the question without an immediate resolution, was its own particular kind of work, quiet and interior and without a place on any list. Beyond the walls of your own home, there was another territory that required tending. The church committee, the school fundraiser, the neighbourhood beautification project, the local charity that needed someone to organise the canned food drive, and that someone was almost always a woman who had already organised everything else. Volunteering in the 1970s was not quite optional for a woman of a certain standing. It was the visible evidence of your values, the proof that you were not only a good wife and mother but a contributing member of something larger. You gave your time because to not give it would have meant a particular kind of social judgment that most women were not willing to risk. The asking of you was rarely direct. It came sideways, the way most of the era's expectations did, through a phone call from the church secretary who mentioned that the committee was short a few hands and everyone knew how capable you were. Through the PTA president who stopped you after the school pickup and said your name with a particular warmth that preceded a request. Through the neighbour who was organising the block's 4th of July gathering and wondered if you might handle the dessert table, just the dessert table, which somehow expanded over the following 2 weeks to include the paper goods and the decorations and the coordination of who was bringing what. You agreed each time because agreeing was the thing you did, because you were capable, and the world around you had a way of converting capability directly into obligation. The committee meetings happened in the evenings, usually, in the fellowship hall of a church or the back room of the school library, under fluorescent lights that made everyone look slightly tired. You sat in folding chairs around tables pushed together into a rough rectangle, and worked through agendas that moved slowly, and were sometimes derailed entirely by disagreements about things so small they would be impossible to explain to anyone who had not been present. The women around you were your neighbours, your acquaintances, the mothers of your children's friends, and you liked most of them, genuinely. The community these gatherings created was real. The belonging it produced was not nothing. That was what made the obligation difficult to examine too closely. You kept a calendar near the telephone, and it filled from the outside in. School events and church obligations and neighbourhood meetings and the fundraiser that needed volunteers to man the tables for a Saturday morning, and somewhere in the white space between all of it, the ordinary requirements of your household, the grocery run and the dentist appointment and the Tuesday that was just a Tuesday with nothing particular attached to it, except all the daily work of keeping everything moving. When the calendar was full, you added things to its edges. When its edges were full, you held the overflow in your head, where it sat alongside everything else you were tracking. The recognition that came from this giving of time was real, but oddly shaped. People praised you for being so involved, so dedicated, such a wonderful member of the community. The praise was sincere. It was also imprecise, because what it praised was the output, the baked goods at the sale and the decorated hall and the organised drive without quite seeing the hours behind it. The planning and the coordination and the energy spent on something that was not your household's direct benefit. The community got the thing. You got the compliment. The exchange was understood to be fair. What sat underneath all of it, unexamined in most households and in most conversations among women who were living the same reality, was the question of choice. Whether the volunteering that looked like generosity was also, at its root, a form of social compliance. Whether the woman who declined, who said she was busy, who protected her time with the same matter-of-fact firmness that no one seemed to question when a man used it, was brave or simply inconsiderate. The women who did decline were discussed. Not harshly, usually, but they were noted, and the noting was its own form of pressure on everyone who heard it. By the later years of the decade, some women had begun to name this particular bind, to point out that unpaid community labour had always flowed predominantly through women's hands, and that the flowing of it had been made to look like nature rather than arrangement. The pointing out was uncomfortable. It was also, for many women who encountered it, clarifying in a way that felt like a window being opened in a room that had been closed for a very long time. The fresh air was welcome. The rearranging of the furniture that it implied was considerably more complicated, and in the meantime the calendar near the telephone continued to fill, and the folding chairs in the fellowship hall continued to wait, and the canned food drive needed someone to organise it, and everyone already knew who that someone would be. There was a map of the neighbourhood that did not exist on paper. It was maintained collectively, updated constantly, and consulted by everyone, though no one would have used the word map or admitted to consulting it. It tracked who entertained well and who did not, whose children were polite and whose were not, whose kitchen you could eat from without hesitation, and whose you privately had questions about. Where you sat on this invisible map depended in no small part on how you conducted yourself at other people's dinner tables, how you spoke about your neighbours when they were not present, and whether you understood the subtle rankings of the social world you moved through and knew how to operate within them without making anyone uncomfortable. The rankings were not about wealth alone, though wealth was part of it. They were about comportment, about the particular combination of graciousness and discretion and social literacy that the era valued in a woman above almost everything else. You could live in the nicest house on the street and still occupy a lower position on the invisible map if your dinner parties were disorganised, or your children misbehaved in public, or you had a reputation for talking too freely about other people's business. The map was drawn in the currency of behaviour, and it was redrawn continuously as new evidence arrived. Moving upward on this map required patience and attention. You accepted invitations from women whose standing was slightly above your own, and you conducted yourself at their tables with care, listening more than you spoke, offering compliments that were genuine but not excessive, demonstrating by your behaviour that you understood the level you were aspiring to and were capable of meeting it. You brought the correct hostess gift. You sent the handwritten thank you note within 2 days. You remembered things about people's children and asked about them the next time you met, and the remembering was not calculated exactly, but it was also not accidental. The women who occupied the highest positions on the map were studied with a particular attention. You noticed how they dressed for casual occasions, which were never entirely casual, how they deflected a pointed question with a graceful pivot that left the ask feeling satisfied rather than rebuffed, how they managed a dinner table conversation that had begun to drift toward territory that would make someone uncomfortable, steering it back to safety with a lightness that made the steering invisible. These were skills. They had been developed over years and they were genuinely impressive. You were developing your own version of them, incrementally, through the accumulated experience of enough social occasions to have made most of the available mistakes and learned from each one. The downward movement on the map was swift and required very little. A comment repeated to the wrong person. A social obligation declined once too often without sufficient explanation. A visible disagreement with a husband at a gathering where people noticed. A child who behaved badly at someone's home and was not corrected firmly enough in front of the right witnesses. The map updated quickly in the downward direction, slowly in the upward, and the asymmetry was something every woman understood without needing it explained. What took years to build could be significantly damaged by a single afternoon, and so the management of your social position was a continuous low-level project that ran underneath everything else, always quietly in operation. What no one said plainly, though everyone understood, was that the stakes of this map were real in practical terms. Your standing in the community shaped which invitations arrived at your door and which did not. It shaped how your children were received, which birthday parties they were included in, which friendships were encouraged. It shaped the ease or difficulty of daily life in the neighbourhood, the warmth or coolness of the greeting at the mailbox, the quality of the favour that might be asked or offered in a moment of need. The social geography was not decorative, it was structural, and maintaining your position within it was work that the era never named as work, though it absorbed considerable time and energy from the women who performed it every day. The car in a 1970s family household was technically shared, but shared in a way that followed its own quiet logic. He took it to work, which meant that for much of the day, your mobility was limited to what was walkable from your front door, and if your neighbourhood was the kind that had been designed in the post-war years, with the assumption that one car would be enough, walkable meant very little. The grocery store, the school, the doctor's office, the bank, the entire infrastructure of your daily life was built around the assumption of a car, and the car was gone. It is a small thing to describe. It was not a small thing to live. You organised your week around the car's availability the way you organised it around the weather, as a fixed condition that shaped what was possible on any given day. Monday he might leave it if his office was close enough to the bus line. Wednesday there was the grocery run, which required the car and required timing the departure so that you were back before school pickup. Errands that could wait were held and bundled into the days when the car was yours, run in a sequence planned for efficiency because there might not be another opportunity until Thursday. The planning of it was constant and invisible and never counted in any accounting of what you contributed to the household. On the days without the car, the neighbourhood contracted. The radius of your life shrank to what was reachable on foot with a child or a bag of groceries or both simultaneously. Some women found this tolerable, particularly those whose neighbourhoods had been built in earlier decades around actual walkable commercial streets, the kind with a pharmacy and a dry goods store and a place to buy bread without getting in a car. Others found themselves effectively marooned, surrounded by houses and lawns and the continuous domestic interior of a life that had no geographic edge they could reach without the car that was, again, not there. The telephone was the partial remedy. You could reach people without going anywhere. You could call the pharmacy and call the school and call the neighbour who had a car and would sometimes run an errand alongside her own, if you asked with sufficient lightness. The telephone was a lifeline of a particular kind, the kind that connected you to the world without allowing you to move through it, which was something and also was not quite enough. Two-car households existed and were increasing through the decade, and for the women in them the geography of daily life was genuinely different, more spacious, more self-directed. The errand run at 10 in the morning without coordinating around anyone else's schedule. The two-car household was becoming the aspiration, and eventually it would become the norm. But in the early and middle 1970s, in the households where one income supported everything, and the car followed the income, the limitation of a single shared vehicle was simply part of the day's architecture, accepted the way the layout of the kitchen was accepted as a given that shaped your movements without requiring anyone to justify it. A woman in the 1970s was not without opinions. She had opinions about the wallpaper and the neighbours and the school curriculum and the best way to remove a wine stain from linen. She had opinions about politics in many cases, though the polite expectation was that she held them softly and did not press them into rooms where they might create friction. She had opinions about her own life, about what she wanted and what she wished were different. But those opinions lived mostly in the interior, in the quiet of a kitchen at noon when the house was briefly empty, in the kind of half-formed thoughts that sometimes arrived while hanging the laundry and evaporated before anyone could ask about them. The approved opinions were numerous and specific. You were permitted strong opinions about food, about the correct way to raise children, about which neighbours' behaviour had recently been disappointing, and why, when you were among the right audience for such a discussion. You were permitted opinions about the home, about colour and arrangement and what needed updating and what could wait another season. You were permitted opinions about the women's magazines and the television programmes, and the books that were being discussed in the reading group that met on the second Tuesday of every month. These were the territories where your perspective was invited and received and responded to as though it had weight. The opinions that required more careful handling were the ones that touched the structure of your life itself. The opinion that the division of a labour in your household was not equitable. The opinion that you might have been good at something outside the house and that it was a loss, even a small one, that you had not found out. The opinion that some of the rules you'd been living by were not natural laws but choices made by people with interests in maintaining them, and that the choices could therefore be unmade. These opinions arrived for many women during this particular decade, some for the first time, some in a newly sharpened form, shaped by books and conversations and a cultural atmosphere that was finally, loudly, asking the questions that had been quiet for so long. A language for difficulty that was not the language of complaint. A community of women who gathered in the fellowship hall after the service and spoke to one another with the particular ease of people who shared a common framework for understanding the world. A space that was, at least in principle, outside the domestic and outside the social, oriented towards something that the housewife's calendar could not schedule or manage or fit between the ironing and the grocery run. That the performance of faith was required alongside the faith itself was the Sunday morning's particular complication. But for many women, what was found inside the performance was worth the cost of producing it. There were women in every neighbourhood who had a reputation for complaining. You knew who they were, everyone did, and the reputation was not neutral. It followed a woman through the social geography of her community like a particular kind of weather, suggesting something about her character, her gratitude, her capacity for contentment. This meant that the ordinary frustrations of a life managed almost entirely for other people's benefit, the fatigue, the repetition, the smallness of some days, had to go somewhere other than out into the world where they might be heard. They went into the privacy of a conversation with a sister or a closest friend. They went into the quiet of a car driven alone on an errand. They went sometimes nowhere at all, compressed into a smile and a "that is fine" and a reaching for the percolator. The woman with the complaining reputation had usually arrived there through a series of small missteps in social judgment, rather than any single transgression. She had mentioned her fatigue at one too many gatherings. She had spoken about the difficulties of her marriage in a setting where the speaking had travelled further than she intended. She had allowed the frustration of a hard week to surface, at a moment when the surface was visible to people who remembered what they saw. The reputation was assembled from fragments, each one minor, and once assembled it was remarkably durable. People heard her differently after that. Her ordinary observations carried a new charge. The same comment that from another woman would have passed unremarked arrived from her already weighted with the expectation of grievance. You navigated around this possibility with care. You knew the settings in which honesty was permissible and the settings in which it was not. A close friend over coffee on a Thursday afternoon, the kind of friend who would hear you and not carry it elsewhere, that was one kind of space. A neighbourhood gathering where the information would circulate freely through the social network, that was another kind entirely. You calibrated your disclosures accordingly, presenting to the wider world the version of yourself that was managing well, reserving the fuller truth for the smaller audience that had demonstrated it could hold it. The discipline required to maintain this calibration was considerable and largely invisible. It meant monitoring your own expression in real time, registering the frustration or the exhaustion as it arrived, and making a quick decision about how much of it to allow into your face or your voice. It meant developing a smooth and practiced set of responses to the question of how are you that were warm and genuine sounding and revealed very little. Fine, thank you. Busy, of course. The children are keeping me on my toes. These were not lies. They were abbreviations, the short form of a longer truth that the occasion did not have room for and that the questioner, in most cases, was not truly asking for. What the era had not yet fully reckoned with was what the suppression cost. The accumulation of unexpressed frustration, directed inward across years, had a weight that the prescription pad in the doctor's office addressed without examining. Contentment was held up as the correct emotional destination, and the path to it was understood to run through gratitude and perspective, and the deliberate choosing to focus on what you had. This was not wrong exactly, but it was incomplete in a way that many women of the 1970s were beginning to feel in their bones, the sense that something in the formula was missing, that the distance between where you were told you should feel and where you actually felt had never quite closed, no matter how diligently you had tried. The 1970s were a decade of considerable cultural noise around women's bodies, and very little of that noise was neutral. Diet culture had been a presence in American women's magazines since at least the 1940s, but by the 70s it had deepened its roots and broadened its reach into television advertising, into doctors' offices, into the well-meaning comments of mothers and mothers-in-law and neighbours who said things like, "You look so well lately," as a way of saying they had noticed the 10 pounds you lost. A woman's weight was not considered a private matter. It was considered a visible measure of her self-discipline, her attractiveness, her commitment to her household and her marriage. The pressure was constant. It was delivered softly, and it had a way of following you into the kitchen every time you reached for something that was not on your approved list. The approved list was informed by whatever the magazines were promoting that season, and the magazines were always promoting something: the grapefruit diet. The cottage cheese and fruit plate that appeared in women's publications with such frequency, it had become its own kind of still life. The calorie counting that required you to carry a small book in your purse and consult it before you ate, which turned every meal into a small act of arithmetic and every appetite into a problem to be solved. Some women did this with genuine discipline and visible results, and received the compliments that followed with complicated feelings, aware that the praise was real but also aware of what had been required to earn it. The commentary arrived from directions you had not always anticipated. The doctor who mentioned your weight at an appointment that had nothing to do with weight, inserting it into a conversation about a winter cold or a sprained ankle, with the brisk confidence of someone noting a relevant data point. The mother who said nothing directly but offered a second serving to everyone at the table except you, the absence of the offering its own particular communication. The husband who said something kind about how you looked when you were thinner, meaning it as a compliment, which in a way it was, and also meaning something else entirely, which was also received. You learned to move through these interactions with the same smooth maintenance required by every other rule in your daily life. You accepted the commentary without visible reaction. You took the diet tips offered by well-meaning women at the church social and said thank you, and filed them in the same interior space where you filed everything else that did not have a safe place to land. You were aware, at some level you could not quite access directly, that the monitoring of your body was connected to larger systems of assessment and control that the era had no good language for naming, and that the connection existed whether or not anyone in your particular household intended it. What was beginning to stir in the decade's cultural atmosphere, in the writing and the conversations and the newly forming awareness that would eventually become a different kind of public discussion, was the question of who had decided these things, who had determined that a woman's body was available for public assessment in a way that a man's was not. The question was uncomfortable. It was also, for the women who let themselves stay with it, quietly revolutionary. There was a specific kind of gratitude that was expected of a housewife in the 1970s, and it was less about feeling thankful than about demonstrating thankfulness at the correct moments and in the correct tone. When your husband brought home a paycheck that covered the bills, you were grateful. When he fixed the leaky faucet on a Saturday afternoon, you were grateful. When he agreed to a vacation you had suggested 3 times before he heard it, you were grateful that he heard it. The gratitude was not insincere necessarily. Many women genuinely felt it. But there was also an expectation wrapped around it, a requirement that the feeling be expressed outwardly and consistently, in a way that confirmed the particular balance of the household as it had been arranged. The language of gratitude was one of the first languages a girl in this era absorbed. You watched your mother thank your father for things that, looked at directly, were simply the ordinary contributions of a person living in a household with other people. The car maintained, the light bulb replaced, the decision made about something that affected everyone. The thanking of these contributions was so consistent and so warm that it took years to notice, if you noticed at all, that the corresponding contributions from the other direction, the meals and the laundry and the scheduling and the emotional labour of keeping everyone connected to one another, did not receive the same quality of acknowledgement. They were expected. Expected things did not require gratitude. They required only continued performance. You said thank you in the particular way that the era had prescribed, not with the brevity of 2 people who had long since passed the formality of it, but with a warmth that communicated appreciation, that made the receiving person feel seen in their contribution. You said it at dinner when the check had been paid and the bills were covered. You said it when something needed fixing and got fixed. You said it at the end of a vacation that had required you to pack for everyone and manage the logistics of travel and keep the children reasonable in the back seat across 500 miles of interstate, because he had taken the time off work for it, which was the visible sacrifice, and visible sacrifices received gratitude. What sat inside the gratitude, unexamined in most conversations and in most households, was the question of whether the balance it confirmed was fair. Gratitude performed consistently enough becomes a kind of affirmation, a daily renewal of the arrangement's legitimacy. To express deep and genuine thankfulness for something is to communicate that the thing was a gift, that it was not owed, that its presence in your life is not to be assumed. The gratitude expected of the 1970s housewife worked quietly in this way, reinforcing a structure by treating its benefits as gifts and its costs as simply the way things were. The women who are beginning to see this dynamic clearly in the decade's later years found that naming it did not make them ungrateful. It made them precise. There is something in the structure of a 1970s household that made asking for help one of the more complicated things a woman could do. The asking itself implied that something had exceeded her capacity, and her capacity, according to the operating assumptions of the era, was supposed to be very large. She was supposed to manage the children and the house and the social calendar and the emotional temperature of the family, and to manage all of it without visible strain. Asking for help was not neutral. It was a small admission, and admissions had consequences. They changed the way people looked at you. They opened the door to a particular kind of sympathy that felt uncomfortably close to judgment. The standard against which you were measuring yourself was assembled from multiple sources, and was therefore difficult to argue with directly, because no single source had set it. It was your mother's example, which made it feel like inheritance rather than expectation. It was the women on your street whose households appeared to run with seamless efficiency, making them a daily ambient benchmark that you could not avoid. It was the magazines that described the capable homemaker in terms that left no room in the description for exhaustion or uncertainty, or the particular afternoon when everything went wrong at once and you sat on the kitchen floor and cried into a dish towel for 4 minutes before the school pickup required you to stand up again. The standard was everywhere, and it had no author and it had no off switch. Asking your husband for more help was its own particular negotiation, shaped by the decades' assumptions about the division of domestic labour that had been inherited from the generations before and had not yet been meaningfully revised in most households. He worked. His work was visible and compensated and took place outside the house, where its difficulty was legible to the world. Your work was invisible in the sense that visibility requires an observer who can see, and the people inside your household had long since stopped seeing the daily management of it, the way you see wallpaper after you have lived with it for years. The asking required you to make visible what had been invisible, to name the labour and establish its weight, and the naming felt like complaining, which circled back to the rule about complaining, and so the asking often didn't happen. The friends who had children the same ages as yours were the nearest available resource, and the exchanging of childcare between households, an hour here and an afternoon there, operated in the informal economy of neighbourhood reciprocity that women had always maintained among themselves. This was not asking for help exactly. It was trading, and trading did not carry the same social weight as need. You took her children on Tuesday morning and she took yours on Thursday, and neither of you called it anything other than convenient, even though it was also, quietly, the system that held both households together in the hours when one pair of hands was not quite enough. Betty Friedan had published her book more than a decade before 1973, and the second wave of feminism was well underway. Women were marching and organising and writing and speaking, and something in the culture was shifting in ways that were audible, even in the quietest suburban neighbourhoods, in the conversations between women at the school pickup line, in the magazine articles that now sometimes ask questions no magazine had asked before. And yet, the daily lived reality of most American housewives in the early and middle 1970s was still organised around a set of expectations that had not caught up with the conversation. Wanting more was becoming thinkable. Acting on that wanting remained complicated, and the rules around it were written in a language of raised eyebrows and concerned questions. And who is watching the children while you're doing that? The ambition that was permitted was ambition exercised within the domestic sphere, perfected and elevated but still contained. You could be an exceptional cook, and that was admired. You could be an exceptional hostess, and that was admired. You could be exceptionally organised, exceptionally involved in the school or the church or the community, and all of that was admired because all of it remained in the service of something other than yourself. The ambition became complicated the moment it pointed outward, toward a life that had a centre other than the household, toward work that was compensated and recognised in the way that work outside the home was compensated and recognised. That ambition had a different temperature. The rooms around you could feel it and respond to it, even when nothing had been said directly. The women who went back to work in the 1970s, and increasing numbers did, navigated a social terrain that was not yet organised to receive them without friction. There were the questions about childcare, asked with genuine concern and also with a faint edge that suggested the concern was not entirely about the children. There were the comments from other women, not hostile necessarily, but carrying within them the particular discomfort of a community whose shared framework was being rearranged. The something must be wrong at home that floated above certain conversations without ever quite landing. There was the managing of the household's full requirements alongside the job's full requirements, because the division of labour inside the home shifted very little when a woman entered the workforce, and so what she gained in one territory she paid for in another. The ambition that lived in the interior, the kind that never quite made it to action, was its own complicated subject. You'd been good at something before you married, or you'd suspected you might be good at something if you'd been given the chance to find out. You had liked school, perhaps, or had been told you were capable in ways that the household's daily requirements did not draw on. The capability did not disappear. It found its outlet where it could in the reading group's discussion of a novel that asked real questions, in the community organising that required genuine strategic thinking, in the management of the household itself, which was considerably more complex than anyone outside it understood. But the fit was imperfect. The container was smaller than what it held, and the decade was the first one in a long time to say that out loud, which was both a gift and a disturbance to the women who heard it and had to decide what, if anything, to do next. A broken appliance, a child who'd been fighting at school, a bill that arrived when the budget was already strained, a piece of news that landed in the middle of an otherwise ordinary afternoon and needed to be absorbed quickly before anyone got home, before the evening began and required you to be composed. The 1970s housewife was, among everything else she was, a crisis manager. She processed the unexpected and turned it into the manageable, quietly and without an audience, because the alternative, a household visibly in distress, was something she'd been trained, by example and by expectation, to prevent. She handled things, that was the phrase. She handled it. As though the handling was simply another item on the list between the laundry and the dinner. The crises came in categories, and you had developed, over years, a triage system as practiced and automatic as breathing. The small ones, the overflowing toilet and the forgotten permission slip, and the argument between children that had escalated past the point of self-resolution, these were absorbed and addressed in the course of the day without leaving a visible mark on the evening. The medium ones required more interior work, the kind of rapid, private recalibration that happened in the 10 minutes between the problem arriving and the first person coming home, where you took the thing that had unsettled you and folded it into a shape the evening could contain. The large ones, the genuinely serious ones, you carried alone for as long as was necessary and revealed only when the revealing could be managed, when the moment was right and the framing was ready, and the distress had been processed enough that it could be presented as information rather than emergency. The telephone was both the source of many crises and the instrument for resolving them. It rang in the middle of the morning with news from the school or the doctor's office, or a family member somewhere else in the country, and the news it carried had to be received in the kitchen, standing up, often with something on the stove and a child nearby, and processed in real time without the benefit of privacy or preparation. You became very good at this particular skill, the skill of receiving difficult information while your face remained composed and your voice remained steady, and the soup on the back burner did not boil over. It was a skill no one had formally taught you. You had simply been placed in the conditions that required it, and had developed it accordingly. The hardware of crisis management lived in specific places around the house. The telephone number for the paediatrician written in the front of the address book. The spare money in the kitchen drawer for the unexpected cost that could not wait for the budget conversation. The neighbour you could call on 30 minutes' notice who would take the children for 2 hours without requiring an explanation. The knowledge, accumulated over years, of exactly which problems could be solved with a phone call and which required waiting, and the patience to distinguish between them accurately under pressure. What was never part of the accounting was the cost of carrying all of this. Crisis management performed as smoothly and consistently as you performed it required a continuous background expenditure of attention and energy that the household's ordinary operations were already drawing on heavily. The calm you presented was not the absence of distress. It was distress managed to the point of invisibility, and the managing required something, extracted something, in ways that accumulated across the months and years of a life organized around other people's need for steadiness. You were the shock absorber for the household. Shock absorbers wear. The wearing was not visible until it was, and by then it had usually been happening for a long time. The 1970s were a decade in which the emotional labour of women in households was beginning to be named as labour for the first time, in terms that were not yet widely understood, but were beginning to circulate in the books and the conversations that were reshaping the era's understanding of what domestic life actually required. The naming did not immediately change anything in most households, but it arrived like a hand placed on a shoulder in a dark room, an acknowledgement that the weight was real, that it had always been real, and that the woman who had been carrying it without complaint had not been doing so because it was light. Walk into any living room in 1972 America, and you were stepping into a curated environment, even if the woman who curated it would not have used that word. The macrame wool hanging above the couch, the harvest gold of the kitchen appliances, the particular shade of avocado green that appeared in everything from the refrigerator to the bath towels, the ceramic rooster on the windowsill, the framed print in the hallway that you had chosen yourself from a catalogue, with the particular care of someone who understood that these choices said something about you, your taste, your sensibility, your investment in the home as a place worth caring about. Decoration was never merely decoration. It was a form of self-expression that the era both permitted and scrutinized in equal measure. The permitted self-expression was real and should not be diminished. For many women of the 1970s, the home was the primary territory in which their aesthetic judgment operated without requiring anyone's approval. You chose the fabric for the curtains. You decided where the furniture sat and what hung on the walls and which lamp went in which corner of the living room. These were genuine decisions, made with genuine care, and the results were yours in a way that very little else in the daily life of a housewife fully was. The harvest gold and the avocado green have become shorthand for a particular kind of dated aesthetic, but at the time they were choices made by women who were paying attention to colour and texture and how a room felt when you moved through it, and the attention itself was a form of creative investment that the era rarely acknowledged as such. The scrutiny arrived through the same channels as all the era's assessments, obliquely and consistently. A neighbour who visited and whose eyes moved across the room in a particular way before she said anything. A mother-in-law whose comments about the new curtains contained within them a quiet, comparative judgment that you registered, and were meant to register. The women's magazines that published room photographs captioned with words like inviting and well-appointed and up-to-date, establishing a moving standard that required continuous monitoring to track. Your home was always being measured against something, and the measuring was always, ultimately, a measuring of you. The updating of the home's aesthetic was constrained by the money rule and the asking rule simultaneously, which meant that the creative vision you had for a room sometimes lived in your head for months or years before the resources to realise it became available. You tore pages from the magazines and kept them in a folder in the kitchen drawer, a private archive of aspirations, rooms that represented where you wanted to go with the house, if the budget ever allowed and the timing was ever right. Some of those pages yellowed over years. Some were eventually realised, in modified form. In the living room, you finally painted the colour you had wanted since 1971. The home's aesthetic also communicated something about your relationship to the decade's broader cultural currents, and the communicating was observed. The macrame and the earth tones and the potted plants crowding the windowsill spoke to a certain set of values that were understood by the neighbourhood to be either fashionable or slightly unconventional, depending on the street you lived on. The formal furniture arranged in the traditional configuration of the generation before yours communicated something different, a stability and a continuity that some households valued and others found stifling. You navigated these signals with the same attention you brought to everything else, aware that the room you had made was being read as a text, and that the reading happened whether or not you had intended to write anything at all. Taking time for yourself in the 1970s was a transaction that required more paperwork than it should have. Not literal paperwork, but the social and emotional equivalent of it. The justification that needed to exist before you could spend an afternoon at a friend's house, or take a Saturday morning class at the community centre, or simply sit in the backyard for 45 minutes reading a novel that had nothing to do with homemaking. The time belonged, in the general understanding of the household, to the household. Using it for yourself was something you did quietly, apologetically, and with the awareness that you owed something in return, a particularly good dinner, a particularly cheerful evening, evidence that the time had not come at anyone's expense. The justification was sometimes internal, the voice in your own head that required you to earn the afternoon before you could take it, to complete a sufficient portion of the list before sitting down, to ensure that the visible evidence of the household's management was in order before allowing yourself the thing you actually wanted. This internal auditor had been installed early and ran continuously, applying the household standards to your own use of time with the same vigilance it applied to everything else. A woman sitting still in the middle of the afternoon, reading or resting or simply being present in her own thoughts, was a woman whose list was presumably complete. And the list was never quite complete. There was always something it would have been responsible to do instead. The justification was sometimes external, issued in response to the question, spoken or simply implied, of what you'd been doing with your day. The question itself was not always an accusation. Sometimes it was simply conversation, the ordinary inquiry of a person entering a house and wanting to know how the hours had gone. But it arrived into a context in which the hours were understood to belong to certain kinds of use and not to others, and you had learned to answer it with an accounting that emphasized the productive portions of the day rather than the restorative ones. You said what you had done, not what you had felt. The feeling of an afternoon spent reading in the backyard was private. The report of it was edited before delivery. The community centre class was the era's approved format for time that was technically for yourself, but legible enough in its structure to be socially acceptable. You were learning something, you were improving yourself, which was an investment that could eventually be redeployed in the service of the household. The pottery class or the painting class or the exercise class that was beginning to appear in increasing numbers as the decade progressed, these had a justification built into their form. They were not simply rest, they were development. The distinction mattered in a way that now requires explanation but then required none. What was harder to justify was time that had no product and no improvement attached to it. The hour in the backyard with a novel. The Saturday morning that was simply yours, used for the slow and unscheduled movement through your own thoughts without any destination. These were the forms of time that the housewife's era had the least framework for accommodating, and they were also, as many women understood in a way they could not always articulate, among the most necessary. The self that needed tending was not the self that could be improved in a community centre class. It was the deeper self, the one underneath the management and the performance, and the continuous orientation toward everyone else's needs. That self required a different quality of time, and the era had not yet decided it was worth protecting. The 1970s were a decade in which the beauty industry was expanding at a remarkable rate, pushing its products and its standards into the daily consciousness of American women through television commercials and magazine advertisements and drugstore displays that offered, in row after row of pastel packaging, the same fundamental promise. You could hold off time if you tried hard enough, if you purchased the right things, if you were willing to put in the daily work of maintenance that the culture increasingly demanded. For the housewife, aging was a particular kind of threat. Youth was one of the currencies she carried in her marriage, and the gradual diminishment of it was something she was expected to address privately, quietly, with the full arsenal of creams and dyes and girdles and whatever else the magazine on the coffee table was recommending that month. The drugstore had its own particular geography in this regard. The aisle devoted to hair colour products was expanding visibly through the decade, filling with boxes that promised natural-looking results and featured photographs of women who appeared to be approximately the age they had been 10 years earlier, smiling with the calm confidence of people who'd successfully negotiated with time. You stood in this aisle and made your assessments with the same careful attention you brought to any significant purchase, reading the boxes, comparing the shade charts, holding the colour samples near your face in the inadequate fluorescent light, and trying to determine whether the woman on the box bore any meaningful relationship to the result you might achieve in your own bathroom on a Tuesday afternoon. The grey that arrived at your temples was not a neutral event. It was a visible data point in the neighbourhood's ongoing assessment of how you were doing, and how you were doing was understood to include how you were looking, and how you were looking was understood to include whether you appeared to be ageing with dignity, which meant with intervention. The woman who allowed her hair to go fully grey in her 40s was making a statement whether she intended to or not, and the statement was received as commentary on her investment in her own appearance, which was received as commentary on her investment in her marriage, which arrived back at the familiar territory where all the rules eventually converged. The body's other changes were managed with the undergarments that the decade's manufacturers produced in abundance, the foundation garments that smoothed and compressed and redirected in ways that required considerable determination to put on in the morning and considerable relief to remove at the end of the day. They were not comfortable. They were not designed to be comfortable. They were designed to produce a silhouette that the era's clothing required and the era's gaze expected. And the expectation was not something you had authored, but was something you had inherited. From your mother's generation, and the generation before that, a long chain of women who had shaped themselves to fit a standard they had not been consulted about before it was handed down. What the 1970s were beginning, slowly and unevenly, to offer was a different framework for thinking about the body over time, one that was not organised entirely around the project of preservation. The natural was becoming a value in other areas of the culture, in food and in clothing, and in the broader aesthetic of a generation that was questioning inherited standards across many domains at once. Whether that questioning reached as far as the aisle of hair colour boxes, whether it arrived into the bedroom where the foundation garments waited in the morning, was a matter that each woman navigated according to her own circumstances, her own household, and the particular version of the rules she'd been given, and was deciding quietly and day by day how much longer to keep. There is a particular weight that arrives near the end of thinking about any of this, and it settles quietly into the conversation the way certain truths do, without announcing themselves loudly. The 1970s housewife was not simply living her own life, she was demonstrating one. Every rule she followed, every silence she kept, every smile she held in place past the moment when it was comfortable, was being witnessed by a daughter who was watching and absorbing and cataloguing, who was learning, without a single lesson being formally delivered, what it meant to be a woman, what it meant to be a wife, what was permitted and what was not, what was said and what was swallowed. The legacy of the rule book was its own reproduction. Your daughter watched you from the kitchen doorway while you cooked, not always consciously, in the way children watch the adults in their households as a continuous background activity of their daily lives. She watched how you moved through the kitchen, efficiently and without complaint, and she was learning the efficiency and absorbing the without complaint simultaneously, taking both in as a single lesson rather than two separate ones. She watched you answer the door with your hair brushed and your blouse straight, even on the days when the hour before the knock had been genuinely difficult, and she was learning that the door required a particular face, that the public and the private were different territories with different rules. She watched you smooth things over at the dinner table, and she was learning the smoothing. She watched you defer, and she was learning when to defer. She was an excellent student of all of it because the curriculum was delivered continuously, embedded in the texture of every ordinary day. The weight of this was something many women of the 1970s began to feel with new sharpness as the decade's cultural conversations introduced a different vocabulary for what they had been living. If the rules were not natural, if they were arrangements that could be rearranged, then the passing of them on to a daughter was not simply the transmission of culture but the transmission of a constraint. The daughter watching from the kitchen doorway was not only learning how to keep a house, she was learning what her life was for, who it belonged to, how much of it was hers to direct. The lesson was long and detailed, and delivered without pause across every year of her childhood, and it arrived before she had the language to examine it, or the standing to question it. Some women in the 1970s made deliberate choices about what they would and would not transmit. They told their daughters, in words, that they were capable of more than the household's daily requirements would reveal. They encouraged the ambitions they themselves had been quietly discouraged from pursuing. They tried to create in the margin between what the culture still required and what they privately hoped for, a small different future that their daughters might be able to inhabit more fully than they had. The trying was imperfect, the margin was narrow, but it was real, and the daughters who grew up in households where some version of this trying was happening carried something forward with them that the rulebook had not intended to pass on. What the 1970s ultimately were, in the history of this particular subject, was a decade of threshold. The old rules were still largely in operation, still shaping the daily lives of millions of women who folded them into their mornings without thinking. But the questioning of those rules had reached a volume that could no longer be contained to the margins of the culture, and the questioning had found its way into the households themselves, into the conversations between women at kitchen tables, and into the books that were being read, and into the slow interior reckoning of women who were looking at the rules they had lived by and beginning, carefully and with considerable courage, to ask whether they had ever been required at all. The answer was arriving. It was not yet complete. And the daughters in the doorways were watching, as daughters always do, to see what their mothers would do with it. The telephone in a 1970s household occupied a specific place, usually the kitchen wall or a small table in the hallway, and it occupied an equally specific place in the social understanding of the neighbourhood. Who you called and how often, and for how long were matters that existed within a framework of unspoken expectation, as detailed and as binding as any of the other rules you navigated daily. A woman who spent too much time on the telephone was a woman who was not attending to her household. A woman who used it efficiently, purposefully, and briefly was a woman who understood her priorities. The telephone was a tool, not a pleasure, and the distinction was enforced by the culture around you with the same quiet consistency that enforced everything else. The calls you made had their own etiquette, layered and specific enough to have been a formal curriculum if anyone had thought to write it down. You didn't call too early in the morning before the household had been set in order and the children dispatched to their various obligations. You didn't call at the dinner hour, which was sacred in the 1970s household, in a way that is difficult to fully convey to anyone who did not grow up inside it. A protected interval when the family was gathered and the outside world was expected to understand that it could wait. You did not call too late in the evening, when the day had concluded and the household had closed itself around its private hours. The window of acceptable calling was real and relatively narrow, and navigating it correctly was part of the social competence the era expected you to have already developed. The length of the call was its own separate consideration. A brief call, made for a clear purpose, and concluded when the purpose was achieved, was the approved format. A long call, the kind that drifted into conversation for the pleasure of conversation, was a different matter, carrying with it the implication that you had time to spare, and time to spare was time that could have been applied to the household's ongoing requirements. There were women who talked on the telephone for what the neighbourhood considered excessive durations, and their names were spoken about in the same tone used for the women who complained too visibly, or whose lawns had gone to seed. The telephone was a social instrument, and its misuse was a social failure, small in scale but cumulative in the way that most small social failures are. The content of what was said on the telephone was governed by its own separate set of rules. You were careful about what you shared and with whom. The telephone line in some neighbourhoods was still a party line in the early years of the decade, which meant that the conversation you believed was private was potentially audible to anyone on the shared line who happened to pick up the receiver at the wrong moment, and some of them picked up at the wrong moment very regularly. Even on a private line, the understanding was that information shared in a phone call had a way of travelling, that the friend you told something to on Tuesday might mention it to someone else by Thursday, and that the careful management of what you sent into the telephone's network was simply part of the general management of your household's reputation and your own. What the telephone also was, quietly and in ways that ran counter to the era's official framing of it, was a lifeline. It was the instrument through which women who were largely confined to their households maintained connections with the outside world, through which the friendships that sustained them were kept alive across the distances of suburban geography, through which news and support and the ordinary sustaining content of human relationship travelled on days when the car was gone and the house was quiet and the afternoon stretched out with a length that required something to fill it. The calls that were too long by the neighbourhood standards were sometimes exactly the right length for the person making them, a duration measured not by efficiency but by need, by the particular need of a person whose daily life did not always provide enough of the human contact that makes daily life bearable. The telephone understood this even when the etiquette around it did not. The daughters watching from the kitchen doorway watched their mothers on the telephone too, absorbing the calibration of it, the careful brevity and the appropriate content and the timing that was never quite accidental. They learned this as they learned everything else, by continuous observation of a woman who had mastered the rules so completely that the mastery had become invisible even to herself. Some of those daughters grew up and spent hours on the telephone without apology, in a decade when the rules had loosened enough to permit it. And some of them carried the brevity forward, the ingrained sense that the call should have a purpose and that the purpose should conclude it, long after anyone was measuring the length of the call against the standard the 1970s had set. There is a specific kind of attention that went into setting a table in a 1970s household, and it was an attention paid not only to function but to signal. The plates arranged at the correct distance from the table's edge, the silverware in its proper sequence, fork to the left, knife and spoon to the right, in the order in which they would be used, which was itself a piece of knowledge you had absorbed so thoroughly that the correct placement felt as natural as the alphabet. The napkin folded and positioned with care, the glasses set precisely, water to the right of the knife, because there was a right and a wrong, and the right had been established before you were born and was not open to revision. The table setting was a small performance, conducted twice a day in most households, and the performance was never only for the people sitting down to eat. The good dishes came out for company and for occasions, and the distinction between the everyday dishes and the good ones was a distinction that communicated something important about how seriously you took a gathering. The good dishes often lived in a china cabinet in the dining room, behind glass doors that were dusted regularly, even though the doors were rarely opened. They had been received as wedding gifts, usually wrapped in tissue paper and packed in boxes that had been opened, with a ceremony of appreciation, and they carried within them a set of expectations about the occasions that would justify their use. A Tuesday dinner did not justify them. A Sunday dinner with family did. The measuring of what an occasion required was something you performed continuously and mostly correctly, and the getting of it wrong in either direction, using the good dishes for something too ordinary or failing to bring them out for something that deserved them, was a small social misstep that people noticed. The food itself arrived at the table in serving dishes rather than from the pots it was cooked in most households of this era, because the serving dish was part of the presentation, and the presentation was part of the meal. You transferred the green beans into the good bowl and the roast onto the platter, and the bread into the basket lined with a cloth napkin, and the transferring took time and created additional dishes to wash, but it was the correct way, and the correct way was not negotiable on the grounds of convenience. The meal as presented to the table was a finished thing, assembled and arranged with the same care you brought to the front of the house, or the appearance of the children before church. It represented you. Everything in the household represented you. The table simply did so several times a day, in a way that was unusually direct. The candles appeared on weeknights in some households, and only on occasions in others, and either approach was defensible, but the choice itself communicated something about the household's relationship to daily ritual, to the idea that an ordinary Tuesday dinner was worth a small gesture toward beauty. You had your own position on this, arrived at through a combination of what you'd grown up watching and what had gradually become your own sensibility over the years of making the household's daily decisions. Some women lit candles every night, and the candlelight was part of the dinner's texture as reliably as the food was. Others reserved the candles for Sundays and company, treating them as a marker of the elevated occasion rather than the ordinary one. What the table rule was ultimately about, underneath all its specific requirements of placement and presentation, was the idea that care was visible, and that visible care said something worth saying. The woman who set her table with attention was a woman who believed the people sitting down to it were worth the attention, and the belief, demonstrated daily in the arrangement of silverware and the presence of the good napkins, was a form of love expressed in the language the era had given her. It was not the only form available to her, but it was one of the most consistent ones, enacted twice a day across the decades of a life spent in the kitchen, and its repetition gave it a weight and a meaning that the individual instances never fully captured on their own. The house was always in some stage of being cleaned, and the cleaning had a rotation as established and as orderly as a liturgical calendar. Monday was laundry, a task that in the pre-permanent press years of the decade's early stretch still involved ironing, still involved the particular smell of steam and hot cotton that filled the laundry room on Monday mornings across thousands of similar houses on thousands of similar streets. Tuesday was for the deeper cleaning, the floors and the baseboards and the surfaces that accumulated a week's worth of the ordinary debris of living. Wednesday was marketing and the midweek errands. Thursday was for the bathrooms, and the bathrooms required a thoroughness that the other rooms did not, a standard of cleanliness that was understood to reflect directly on the household's general character in the specific way that bathrooms always have. The rotation moved through the week with the reliability of weather, and you moved through it with the same matter-of-fact competence you brought to everything else. The cleaning was not performed for an audience in any direct sense, and yet the awareness of a potential audience was always faintly present, because the house could receive visitors at any hour of the day, and the state in which it received them was understood to be the state in which you kept it. The neighbour who stopped by on a Tuesday afternoon was seeing your house midweek, between the Sunday of its best presentation and the Friday of its accumulated week, and what she saw in that unguarded middle was understood to be more revealing than the carefully prepared state of a dinner party. You kept the house in a condition that could receive a Tuesday afternoon visitor without requiring you to apologise, and maintaining that condition required that the cleaning never fully stop. The products arrayed under your kitchen sink and in the closet that held the mop and the brooms and the vacuum cleaner were a considerable arsenal, each one designed for a specific surface and a specific type of dirt, and bearing a specific promise about the results its application would produce. The lemon scent of the furniture polish, the sharp, clean smell of the bathroom cleaner that arrived in a can and was applied with a sponge and left the porcelain with a brightness that was itself a kind of accomplishment. The particular satisfaction of a floor that had been mopped and was still slightly damp, reflecting the kitchen light with a clarity it did not have an hour before. These sensory rewards were real, and they were part of what made the cleaning sustainable across the years of daily repetition, the way the smell of bread baking rewards the baker before anyone else has entered the kitchen. What was never examined closely was whether the standard being maintained was necessary, or whether it had been set at its particular level by the same general system of expectation and social scrutiny that had set all the other standards. The clean house was a clean house. Its cleanliness was virtuous. The woman who maintained it was a good housekeeper, which was a category of woman worth being. These connections were not argued. They were simply understood by everyone in the household and everyone in the neighbourhood, and the understanding was old enough and consistent enough to have acquired the character of natural law. It was only when you stepped outside the understanding and looked back at it from a sufficient distance that the arbitrariness of the standard became visible, that you could see it had been chosen and could therefore have been chosen differently, and that the energy it consumed across a life had been very considerable indeed. What happened between a husband and wife in a 1970s household was understood by both of them and by the neighbourhood around them to be a private matter, and the privacy was maintained with a vigilance that served multiple purposes simultaneously. It protected the household from the kind of social scrutiny that an unhappy marriage attracted. It protected the children from information they were not old enough to process. It protected the husband from a particular kind of public judgment and the wife from a different kind of public judgment, and both kinds of protection were real, though they were not symmetrical in the way that real protection requires. The marriage was a unit, presented to the world as stable and functional, and the presentation was maintained regardless of what the interior of the unit contained. You learned the language of the happy marriage the way you learned the language of the clean house and the well-set table, by observation, and by the gradual refinement of a skill you'd been practicing since before you fully understood what you were practicing. The couple that appeared well matched at a neighbourhood gathering appeared well matched through the management of specific behaviours, the warm reference to something he had said or done, the easy familiarity of a long partnership, expressed in small public gestures, the absence of any tone in your voice when you spoke about him that could be read as something other than contentment. You managed these things automatically, the way you managed most things, and the automaticity was itself a form of mastery. The rehearsal for these public performances happened in the ordinary private moments of the marriage itself, in the way you learned what to say and what to leave unsaid, what to smooth over and what to let breathe, the geography of the relationship's sensitivities, and how to move through them without creating friction that would carry into the social world outside. Every long marriage develops this interior map, and you knew yours in the detailed, unsentimental way of someone who has navigated the same landscape in every season. You knew which topics required careful handling. You knew the difference between the silence that was peaceful and the silence that was pressurized. You knew, with the accuracy of long proximity, how he would respond to each of the ways you might say a difficult thing, and you chose the way accordingly, or sometimes chose not to say the thing at all. The children absorbed the performance too in the ways children always absorb the emotional texture of their households, not through the words that were spoken, but through the register beneath the words, the temperature of a room, the particular quality of a quiet that was comfortable or one that was not. You were aware of being watched in this additional way, by small people who were conducting their own continuous study of what marriage looked like and what it required, and the awareness added another layer to the already layered project of the public presentation. You were not only performing for the neighbourhood, you were performing for the future, modelling something that would be carried forward in the bodies and the expectations of the people you were raising. There were households where the distance between the performance and the reality was narrow, where the warmth displayed in public was genuinely close to the warmth that existed in private, where the marriage was not a performance at all in the deeper sense, but simply a life lived in two registers, one shared with the world and one kept for the household's own. These marriages existed and were not rare, and the women in them navigated the era's expectations from a position of comparative ease, maintaining the performance because it matched what was true rather than because it concealed what was not. They are part of the story too, the women who looked happy at the dinner party and were, quietly and imperfectly, and with the full complexity of a long human partnership, actually happy. But the rule applied to everyone equally, to the happy marriages and the struggling ones alike, because the rule was not about the reality of the marriage, it was about the presentation of it, and the presenting was required regardless of what it cost, regardless of what it concealed, regardless of whether the woman doing the presenting had chosen the thing she was presenting, or had arrived at it through the accumulated pressures of a life, organised around choices made before she was old enough to understand what choosing meant. The performance was the requirement. The interior was yours to manage privately and without complaint. What the 1970s were beginning to introduce into this particular silence was the possibility of a different kind of privacy, one that was not organised around concealment, but around genuine protection of something worth protecting. The distinction was subtle and important. The old privacy said, "Do not let anyone see the difficulty." The new privacy that some women were beginning to construct said, "The interior of this marriage belongs to the people in it, and the belonging is not the same as hiding." One was a cage built of shame and social pressure. The other was a boundary built of self-determination. The distance between them was the distance the decade was slowly, unevenly, and not yet completely crossing. Here is where everything arrives, in the end. All the rules, taken together, from the morning appearance to the set table, to the managed crisis to the telephone call calibrated for the correct length, all of them were expressions of a single larger rule that sat underneath the others and gave them their particular shape. The work of the household was not work. It was love, expressed daily in the form of tasks. It was care, made visible through clean floors and folded laundry and meals that appeared at the correct hour with the correct warmth. It was the natural expression of a woman's nature, which was understood to be oriented toward nurturing and maintaining and sustaining, and because it was natural, it required no compensation and no acknowledgement and no particular recognition beyond the good life it helped to produce. This was the rule that made all the other rules possible, and it was the rule that the 1970s were beginning, slowly and against considerable resistance, to dismantle. The hours were not counted because counting them would have required calling them something. A survey from the era estimated that the average American housewife worked in excess of 50 hours per week in the direct management of her household, not including the childcare that ran beneath all of it as a continuous background requirement. 50 hours, unreported, uncompensated, performed in the private interior of a domestic life that the culture had agreed to understand as something other than labour. The woman who did this work was not a worker. She was a wife and mother. The distinction was understood to be meaningful. It was meaningful primarily to the people for whom it was convenient. The individual tasks were so familiar that they had become nearly invisible even to the woman performing them. The making of a bed required less conscious attention than tying a shoe, executed with the automatic competence of something done thousands of times. the sheet pulled smooth, and the pillow set just so, and the whole thing completed in under 2 minutes by a person who was already thinking about the next thing on the list. The preparation of a meal moved through its stages the same way. Onions softened in butter, while the water came to the boil, while the table was being considered and the children's afternoon was being tracked from the kitchen window. The multitasking was not experienced as multitasking. It was simply the texture of the day, the particular density of a life in which many things were always happening at once, and the management of their simultaneity was constant and unremarked. What made the invisibility so durable was how thoroughly it had been absorbed into the understanding of what women simply were. The woman who kept her house well was not praised for her labour in the way a craftsman might be praised for a well-made thing. She was confirmed in her nature, recognised as the kind of woman she was supposed to be. The work was the evidence of the character, not a product separate from it that could be evaluated on its own terms. This meant that no individual task could be extracted from the whole and examined as labour, because each individual task was understood to be an expression of love and care and the natural orientation of a woman toward her household, and love does not bill by the hour. You felt the labour in your body at the end of a long day in the particular way that physical and mental work combined leaves its trace, in the shoulders and the lower back, and the specific tiredness behind the eyes that comes from continuous attentiveness. You felt it in the Friday afternoon lull that arrived when the week's accumulated requirements had been met and there was a brief interval, measured in an hour or two before the weekend introduced its own set of demands. You felt it in the particular satisfaction of a kitchen cleaned at the end of the evening, the counters wiped and the dishes done, and the whole room returned to the order it would leave by morning, a satisfaction that was real and genuine, and also tinged with the knowledge that the returning of it to order was already underway before the cleaning was finished. The body knew what the culture did not name. The body kept its own accounting in the shorthand of fatigue and in the way that rest, when it finally arrived, had the particular quality of something genuinely earned. The rest itself was complicated by the same framework that complicated everything else. Rest required justification in the way that time for yourself required justification, because time not spent on the household's requirements was time that needed a reason. The tiredness that accumulated across a week of invisible labour was not recognised as the natural consequence of significant and sustained effort, because the effort had not been named as effort. So the rest it required had to be justified on other grounds, on the basis of a headache or a cold coming on, or simply the strategic timing of a quiet afternoon positioned between two periods of visible productivity. You rested in the margins and you called it something other than what it was. What the 1970s gave to the women living inside all of this was the beginning of a language. Not a complete language, not yet, and not one that immediately changed the conditions it described, but words for the experience that had not existed before, or had not been used in these combinations, in these public forums, by these many voices speaking at once. The words arrived into households and were received differently by different women. Some found them clarifying and were changed by them. Some found them threatening and pushed them away. Some held them quietly and did nothing visible, and were nevertheless subtly altered by the holding. The work continued through all of it. The floors were swept and the tables were set and the children were collected and the dinners were made, in the 1970s and in the decades that followed, by women who were doing the work with a new awareness of what they were doing and what it cost and what it was worth. The awareness changed the work slowly and incompletely, and in ways that are still unfinished. But it changed it, and the women who carried that awareness forward into their daughters' households and into the culture's long argument with itself about what women owe and what they are owed, were doing something that the invisible labour rule had never intended to permit. They were making the invisible visible, and once seen, it could not be entirely unseen again. And so, here we are, at the end of a long walk through a world that smelled of lemon furniture polish and percolated coffee and the particular warmth of a house that someone had spent their whole day tending. We have moved through the mornings and the kitchens and the dinner tables and the quiet late evenings of women who lived by rules they had not written and carried weight they had not named, and who did it all, most days, with a grace that the era rarely stopped to acknowledge. There is something worth carrying forward from all of this, even now, even from a distance. Not the rules themselves, which were often unfair and sometimes unkind, but the quality of attention that lived inside them, the care taken with a table setting, the deliberateness of a meal planned for the people you loved, the understanding that the ordinary details of a shared life, the freshly made bed and the door answered warmly and the neighbour remembered by name, are not small things. They never were. The women who lived this era were not waiting for history to notice them. They were simply present, in their kitchens and their neighbourhoods and their complicated, tender, exhausting lives, doing what needed to be done with the tools they'd been given. They deserve to be remembered not as cautionary tales or as symbols of another time's limitations, but as people, capable, attentive, resilient people who held entire worlds together with their hands and their patience and their quiet, persistent care. So tonight, as your own day settles into stillness, take a moment to notice whatever is good and near, the warmth of the room, the softness of where you are resting, the ordinary miracle of a life that is yours. That noticing is enough. It has always been enough. Sleep well.